Welcome to the Autism Outreach Podcast. I am your host, Rose Griffin, and we have an amazing discussion today with Haley Moss. We talk about so many different topics, and one of the guiding principles that we talk about is practicing with empathy. I asked Haley to be on the podcast today. I got to know her a little bit better. I had known who she was for a couple of years now, but we're on the same executive conference planning committee for a local conference here in the Ohio area for milestones that I've been a part of for many, many years. And so I really wanted to have her on and talk with her about ableism and neurodiversity. We talk about those terms, and those terms may be new to you. What is ableism? What does that mean? What is neurodiversity? What does that mean? And Haley shares with us things that we can do in our clinical practice so that we are being inclusive, so that we are practicing with empathy. So it is an amazing episode today. Haley is the first openly autistic lawyer in Florida. She is an educator, a keynote speaker, the author of 4 books that guide neurodivergent individuals through professional and personal challenges. She is a consultant to top corporations and nonprofits that seek her guidance in creating a diverse workplace. She has authored many books, the Young Autistic Adults Independence Handbook, and many, many others. She is just a great person, just a wealth of information. And I'm so excited that you are going to get to learn from her today. Let's get started with the episode.
You're listening to Autism Outreach Podcast, a podcast full of ready-to-use strategies to help those with autism strengthen their communication skills. Here's your host, Rose Griffin of ABA Speech, a speech therapist and board-certified behavior analyst who shares tips you can use in your next therapy session. Welcome to the Autism Outreach Podcast. This is episode 66. I can't believe it. So exciting. And we have an amazing show for you today. Today we have with us Haley Moss. Welcome, Haley. It's so nice to have you on.
Thank you so much for having me.
And we met, I've known about your work and who you are for a couple years now, but we're on the same planning committee for a conference for the Milestones organization. And we got to know each other a little bit better. And I was like, oh my goodness, you have definitely been somebody I wanted to have on the podcast. So thanks so much for coming on and being a guest. It means a lot to me.
Absolutely. And it's been such a pleasure getting to know you a little bit better and getting to serve with you on Milestones and hopefully getting to continue to make an impact in our community.
Yeah, absolutely. And so for those of us who do not know who you are, know much about your journey, can you tell us a little bit or a lot about, can you tell us about you and your journey and why, supporting the autism community and just being such a trailblazer like you are is close to your heart?
Okay, let's figure out where we want to start with this conversation. So if you don't know me, I am an author, I am an attorney, I am an artist, and I am an advocate, and I am also autistic. So I am from sunny Miami, Florida. I know everyone always comments at some point of the year asking about weather. Depending on where you are and when you're listening, you might be thinking, and chances are it is probably humid and sunny out here. But that aside, I was diagnosed in the late 90s when I was about 3 years old. I am in my late 20s at this point. Time seems to somehow fly. Mm-hmm. And when I was first diagnosed, I always like to remind people that the late 90s were a very different time. So we did not have the same prevalence rates that we had now. We also had a wider gender disparity. We did not have the internet in as full of force as we do now. So I actually got to hear not too long ago about my parents looking up things on dial-up, which really is kind of a nostalgia trip for some of us. Or maybe it's something that we'd prefer to leave back in the late 90s.
Yes.
But all sorts of things like that were part of my journey. And I think what was also really empowering is my parents are extremely supportive human beings. They've always been at the forefront of everything. And even kind of to get to the topics I know that we plan on talking about today, excuse me. is even how my parents told me that I'm autistic. Is I was 9 years old and absolutely enamored with everything Harry Potter. That I loved the series. Harry and I shared this July 31st birthday. Everything about it was just like meant for me at that age. And one day before starting the 4th grade, my mom comes up to me and tells me that I have magical powers just like Harry. And of course, being 9 years old, I'm going to believe this, right? Like, there's no way I'm not going to believe this. Mm-hmm. And I'm half expecting like my Hogwarts letter to arrive any second. But what ends up happening is my mom explains to me that I'm autistic and that different is neither better nor worse. It's just different. Mm-hmm. And different can be extraordinary. And she starts relating this to kind of how Harry doesn't fit in with the muggles at home who don't practice magic and aren't part of the magical world. And he also doesn't quite fit in the magical world either. He's different from all the other wizards and witches because he has that lightning bolt scar on his forehead. He's seen as the boy who lived. He has all of this unnecessary and sometimes unwanted attention on him. But no matter how he feels and no matter how he navigates these two very different worlds, he's still the hero of the story. And that's something that really resonated with me, is that we weren't somehow seeing Harry or autistic people as outcasts or less than in some way, shape, or form, just part of the story, and that we have the ability to write our own stories. I think that's something that really stuck with me throughout my entire life. And of course, fast forward as much as we want in my journey, I end up writing a couple books. I write about middle school. I write about college. I write about lawyers. I write about transitioning to adulthood. I've written about anything and everything in the autism sphere, I feel like, because that self-advocate perspective is so often missing. But when I tell the story about my mom and my dad and Harry Potter, I tell it because it was kind of one of those early indicators that kind of almost explored exactly where I was going to go as an adult, and talking about things like neurodiversity and what acceptance really looks like, and thinking about autism from a social justice perspective and equity. I think it's really fascinating kind of how that foreshadowed and really laid the groundwork for so much of what I do today.
Yeah, it's amazing. I love that you shared, how your parents told you, because I've had a lot of autistic individuals on the podcast, and that seems to come up on their journey as how they share that. It sounds like your parents are very loving people. And it sounds like it really sets you on, kind of foreshadowing all the great work that you're doing now in general. But
we're big fans of them around here.
Yeah. So do you have other siblings? I'm just kind of curious a little bit about your back. You don't? Okay. Nope. You're the only child. Okay.
Nope. I always grew up with dogs, and a couple of years ago we got a cat.
Okay. Nice. Oh, I'm jealous. I like TikTok. My son is allergic to everything, so we can't have any pets anymore, which makes me very sad. But anyway, on TikTok, I'm on dog talk, I'm on cat TikTok. I get all the videos and send them to my mom because I miss having a pet. Okay, that's very nice. That's very cool. So did you go to, I'm just wondering, because 3 days a week I do work as a public school speech therapist, and I just had Jared Stewart on. I don't know if you know who Jared Stewart is, but he is a BCBA, and he is an autistic individual too. He's kind of friendly with Carrie Magro, and they have done some presenting together. But he just talked about how he had not a great public school experience, but it kind of shaped him into the work that he's doing now. Did you go to public school, or did you end up going to a specialized program? Or
I was in mainstream private school for most of my schooling. I started out in public special education, and then I ended up in private school for most of my career. And I re-entered the public school system when I went through the state university system. So go Gators. Okay. I went at the University of Florida.
Oh, awesome. Okay, that's very cool. One of the things you talked about is acceptance. And today our topic is, and I asked you to come on and talk. There's so many things you could chat about, but talk about ableism and neurodiversity. And this episode is going to air during Autism Acceptance Month. And I definitely think those are things I want to talk about. I talk about this a lot because, I have an online business with ABA Speech, so I'm online a lot. But I think some people who are listening may not really understand what these words mean, or what what's kind of behind all this. And so I'm excited to discuss that. So what does acceptance mean for autistic individuals?
Oh my gosh. The answers that you're going to get from this question is something that I feel like your mileage will definitely vary. But to me, acceptance is a world that has me in mind when it's being designed. It is a world that I don't have to fight to be included. I don't have to do all of the extra labor. So I always think about that the work, true acceptance and true inclusion would be that the work that we are all doing is not necessary. I think that's very idealistic to say, but I still feel that that is really important. So I'm always like, yeah, if I don't have to educate people about bias, about ableism and all the things that we're talking about today, if we don't have to have those tough conversations, and because we are at that point where it's not relevant, that would be amazing. I just don't foresee that happening so quickly. I think we're trying however we can to get there, but I also see acceptance is also treating autistic people like people. Sometimes not, I'm kind of getting rid of some of the biases and ableism that we really think about. So whether it's being treated like children, which you might hear referred to as infantilization, whether it's people assuming what you can and can't do all the time when you're offered assistance, when it's neither wanted nor needed, or you don't have your competence presumed, or your support needs are being dismissed. There's so much that goes into this, and it's a lot to unpack. But acceptance is not having to worry about that and realizing that you can be your full self and you don't have to mask your autism or any of that stuff. I think that would take such an emotional and societal and cultural burden off of so many folks, but that's just my opinion.
And we have talked about the term masking before, but for people that aren't familiar with that term, can you just talk about what that means? Because most of the people who do listen to the podcast are speech language pathologists. So I know when I'm listening to podcasts or when I'm taking in information, especially from the neurodiversity, I'm going to call it a movement, but that might be wrong. I'm sorry. Like I'm always trying to learn more and how what I can learn from autistic individuals and, from neurodiversity, and how can I apply that into my practice. But I think, some people may not have even heard that term before. So can you talk to me about what masking is and just kind of define that for the audience and listeners?
Absolutely. So masking is this idea that you are going to suppress or hide or camouflage to some extent autistic or neurodivergent traits in order to gain social acceptance, to have this sort of passing as neurotypical or pretending to be normal. Again, whatever normal is supposed to mean. That's always my big joke because I don't really know what normal is and nobody really strives to be normal, but I digress. But masking really kind of does go to that heart of that, is you feel like you're putting on a different persona because of different societal aspects. So maybe you want to be liked. Maybe you want to feel accepted. Maybe you're afraid that if you are stimming too much, or also amongst different marginalized identities, that if you are acting too autistic, you might be profiled or a victim of assault. There's a lot of different considerations that go into it. And I think it's very often that we reduce this type of behavior in these high camouflaging, high masking individuals. We immediately assume it's all women and girls. While this has been reported largely among that, I would say it's a high camouflaging presentation of autism because it does not discriminate on gender or gender identity. We see this with boys. We see this with people who aren't cisgender. We see this with people who are transgender or non-binary. We do see it with cis boys as well. So I think it's really important that we don't see this as a female autism thing, because that's not really true as we're beginning to learn more and more about autism. And also what makes masking so complicated and difficult to talk about is people who do it a lot may or may not always realize consciously that they're doing it. It might be something that leads to burnout, might be low self-esteem, or eventually be that catalyst for a lot of adults who discover later in life that they're autistic because they realize they can't keep up that mask of quote unquote neurotypical and perform it that well, or it's just too exhausting to perform it. And the easiest way that I like to describe this is the internalization of the message, be yourself, but not like that. Is that we encourage people to be themselves, but not too much of themselves, or like do it, but in this very socially accepted, specific, rigid way that fits our definition of neurotypicality.
Yeah.
So it's kind of a mess, to be quite honest.
No, it's good just to start the dialogue because, a big part of speech therapy and, so clinically, I have my own private practice where I see younger students, but 3 days a week, I am a public school speech therapist and I work with middle school and high school students. And, a big part of speech therapy, and especially for individuals with autism or autistic individuals, has historically been social skills. And so I know that hopefully people listening to this, I mean, I think the first
I have so many feelings on social skills.
Right. Is kind of analyzing. I think it's always really important to analyze why we're doing what we're doing.
Yes.
What's hard in a public school, though, is that you're not just giving your clinical expertise. And honestly, Hallie, sometimes my clinical expertise, people don't care what I have to say because there are advocates involved, there's lawyers involved. I work in a pretty affluent school district. And so it's not really always up to me, right? I'm a member of the team, but sometimes we're making these clinical treatment decisions and I'm trying to share my expertise, about what should be done. But sometimes it's really hard because other members of the team, parents, I mean, I'm just thinking of parents sometimes, we might be working on things as professionals. And I think we really need to think about like, how is this really going to help the student? I mean, can you talk about that a little bit? Because I mean, I guess in my mind, and I have said this before, I do think some social skills instruction might be okay. I always try to tie it to competitive employment and how it might affect somebody who's autistic in the workplace. But I don't know what your thought is on that, or like, if you even think that's okay. Like, but can you talk about social skills a little bit? Because I see
social skills as almost like being bilingual, if that makes sense. Because it's not that we lack social skills. We have different natural social skills. So it's not a failed version of neurotypical, which I think is so often what we rest upon. And this really all ties back to our incoming discussion of ableism. Yeah. Is that we assume that we're basically just broken neurotypicals. Right. So there's a BCBA who I follow on Instagram who's also autistic, and she talks a lot about this idea of being neurobilingual, and that's how she describes it. But I've always thought of it like speaking two different languages as well. That's something that I've kind of been bouncing around my head for years. I tried to say it as a teenager and it just never came out right. And when I look at neurotypical social skills for a lot of autistic people, no matter how much we learn them and how much we use them, it will always sound like we have an accent, like we're from another place. And someone will always hear that autistic, quote unquote, accent. You will never exactly get it right, even no matter how hard you're trying, just like someone who might be learning a second language. But we're not teaching, I think, when it comes to social skills, why they're important. We just say, you must do this and follow this very rigid thing. If you explain to me, we are doing this specific thing because in this culture, it is considered polite, or we're doing this in this culture because think about it just like when we learn language and that there's different nuances between culture. And I think that's something that we don't quite get a lot, is that social skills is a form of culture and it's very relative. So the social skills that I use when I communicate with other autistic and neurodivergent people are probably not the ones that I would be using having a one-on-one conversation with you. Right. It is a very different form of communication. And someone mentioned not too long ago to me that they were curious, is this a form of code switching? And that's a very different conversation as well, like how people of different races or marginalized races might be changing how they speak and present when they are around people who are not of the same race, or how they act at home. And of course, autistic people of color both exist on these lines of masking, of being using different social skills, and also code switching. So there's a lot that really goes into this. And I think that's what we miss the mark on so often. So I think there's, of course, a very natural survival instinct and you have to know these skills, but I don't think we always understand why. And we often do it at the expense of saying the language that you already speak is wrong. When the language that you're already speaking or the social skills you already have, it's not that they're wrong. Chances are you probably just don't understand them because you don't understand why that's functional. So I know, think about when you have clients or something that are very, very blunt with you. And in your culture, it's considered very rude to say that your sweater is ugly, for instance. But in our culture, that is something to be celebrated because you are being very honest. And those things often have this tension between them. And who's to say what is rude in what place? Because in some places, you will consider lying and saying that ugly sweater is beautiful is offensive. So I think that we have to really consider, when we talk about these social skills, you might say that sweater isn't ugly because you might hurt that person's feelings and kind of spell it out so they understand this is a skill that I can use if I'm afraid that I'm going to hurt someone's feelings if I use the skill that I want to use. Or that I think I should be using, or that I would naturally use. So then you kind of can walk through that cultural implication and process, not just, you can never say that the sweater is ugly. Well, why? It is. Like when you think about this, it makes a lot of sense, but we try to really science it a lot more than I think it needs to be sometimes, is understand that there are reasons that people do what they do. And I think as well, even just tying it to a place of trust and confidence, because I think that understanding neurotypical social skills is a very important thing, especially as an adult, that I'm able to understand it. It doesn't mean that I get it right all the time, because I certainly don't. But I have a working knowledge, I like to say, and it's always evolving, of what people do, why they do it. And then I also understand in neurodivergent culture why people do what they do. And sometimes I'm like, that makes perfect sense.
Yeah.
Like, I know when they discontinue a favorite food or something, that autistic people stock up on it, because if it's gone, it's gone.
Right.
And then neurotypical people are like, why would you get 20,000 things of like Diet Coke?
Right.
Because they're not going to make Diet Coke with that specific ingredient anymore. And then I'll never have it again. And then my routine's going to go goodbye for the rest of my life. Of course, I'm stocking up on it. Like,
yeah. Right.
And, your neurotypical people are like, that makes no sense. And then an autistic person will tell me something very similar. And I'm like, yeah, good move. You didn't get enough of it.
Yeah, right.
Because 20,000 cans isn't going to last you your lifetime. So go back.
Oh, I love that.
Because you're just going to be kicking the football down on when that routine's going to come to an end. So prolong it as long as possible. Maybe they'll actually re-add the ingredient at some point, and then you're extra prepared.
No, I love
think
that.
It's just how we look at these things.
Yeah.
And when we see that there is this different culture, I think that looking at it as culture and ignoring that autistic culture is very real. And that in a lot of kids, especially when we focus so much on neurotypical social skills, we're denying them that ability to explore their own brains, how they work, and their own heritage. We're almost sometimes teaching them that your brain is working against you.
Yeah. And I love that. I had a lady named Robin Restigno. She's actually getting
I love Robin.
Yeah. So she's getting her PhD, and she's an autistic adult. She actually was a former special ed teacher, but she talked a lot about just, that social skills may have a place, but just making sure, that the same idea of, as providers, we don't want autistic people by any stretch to feel like they're broken or the way that they're doing isn't right. And I don't think that everybody is really analyzing their therapy to that way. And I really wish we would, because, I think what we can do is hard.
And I think from the autistic community, we also have to be empathetic to where providers are coming from. Like you mentioned that you work in the public schools. You only get so much time in a day.
Right.
You only have so much that you're able to do to hit all those benchmarks as compared to your clients in private practice.
Right. Yeah.
That you are limited on resources. And I think about this a lot, like in legal world, when we talk about private criminal defense attorneys and public defenders.
Yeah.
That a private criminal defense attorney probably has much more time and resource to dedicate to your case than a public defender who is getting underpaid and needs to clear their docket.
Right. Yeah. No,
and probably doesn't know the facts of your case beyond just a file, and they need to get through it because that is what the system demands.
Right. And every place is different. But I like that.
And it doesn't mean that that person doesn't care. It means that there's something more pressing because they are part of something else. And state and local governments have their own demands on employees. Like that's something I think that a lot of folks miss, that nuance.
Yeah. No, that's,
and we just immediately write it off as the provider just doesn't care.
Yeah.
Which, as I know from talking to you and plenty of other providers, you obviously care. There's just so much that you can do. And I think that it's really important that all of us have that empathy towards providers and towards autistic people at the same time. This is a two-way street. It's not really an us versus them. It's more of we all want the same thing. We just have very different approaches to getting it. And some of us are working with more limited resources than others. Yeah, that's a good way. Every environment is different. So I love those thoughts. Everybody just wants well-adjusted, happy people.
Yes. And I think that's what everybody wants. When you become a speech therapist, you really do go into the field. I mean, I'm a speech therapist and a BCBA, but you do go into these professions because you want to help others. And I think sometimes, it's just, I think obviously there is science and everything's kind of changing, and we need to be analyzing our interventions to make sure that they are really helpful and that they're not really hurtful, because I mean, that was something that kind of Robin had said, people don't want to feel like, that they're not broken, that it's like autistic individuals have social skills. They are different than social skills that maybe a neurotypical person has. So I think that's a really good way to frame it, because I definitely don't think that everybody is analyzing it and thinking about it that way.
And that's where you see that disconnect when people who speak two different languages essentially can't understand each other.
Right.
It's not that somebody is like cursing the other person out or something. It's that they just don't understand.
Right.
I live in a very multilingual, multicultural city, and that is something that I know. And it's not that I'm getting angry if I don't understand, or the person I'm speaking to doesn't understand when I'm giving directions or something. It's just they have a different language that they speak. And it's up to me to sometimes figure out how can I still give this person the help that they need or directions. Mm-hmm. Maybe I'll draw a picture. Maybe I'll point. Maybe I'll do something else because my non-English abilities are pretty not so great, but I try my best.
Yeah. Yeah, no, definitely. So that was one of the things I wanted to talk about today is neurodiversity. Because if you've spent any time online, I spend just way too much time. I put myself on a plan of not spending as much time online. But when you have an online business, it's really hard to not be online. But if you're not online, you may not have really heard much about neurodiversity. So for people that aren't really sure what that term means, and we're actually going to, I'm so excited. By the time this airs, we might already have it on our website, but somebody from Milestones and an autistic advocate are going to be doing a training on neurodiversity, kind of like the training we heard a little bit in our executive meeting, because I was so fascinated by that.
I had so many feelings about some of those things in our executive meetings. Yeah. But that's a different story, especially when, every time I go to meetings and I'm like the self-advocate, I always feel very awkward because I usually will dissent.
Yeah.
And it's definitely kind of scary sometimes being in that minority opinion.
Yeah.
And having to sometimes scream a little bit louder because you realize there are not people who this is affecting in the room, and you realize where the biases are and things like that.
Yeah. Yeah.
Because literally when we had that last training in our meeting, I remember sitting there and going, what? This is great that you're attempting to do this, but this should be done by the autistic person, not by the staff.
Right.
Like this is wrong. Like this is not sitting with me well. And I had another colleague on the committee that I'm friendly with, and I was texting that person, and I was like, am I the only one who doesn't feel comfortable with this? And I can't quite 100% put my finger on it. And together we're like, this is why we both feel uncomfortable with this. I'm like, nailed it.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I think it definitely needs to come from somebody who's autistic. You know what I mean? Definitely. So can you talk to people about neurodiversity and kind of what that, I mean, I know that's a big whole thing, but
I'm so sorry for the sidebar.
No, but people that maybe have never heard that term before, I'm definitely trying to have more outreach and share exactly what that means. And with my audience, anytime I share about it on Instagram, it's very popular. So I definitely, and I have people on my email list. I have about 30,000 people on my email list. And I send out like a quarterly survey, about
so many people.
Like, how can I help you? And, there are definitely many people who said, I want to make sure that I am thinking about neurodiversity and autistic adults and making sure that I'm incorporating some of the things that we might be seeing coming from that movement. But can you, for people who maybe have not heard of that, which seems strange to say, but I know that there's probably people who haven't heard much about that, exactly kind of what that means.
I totally get what you were saying, that if you don't spend a lot of time online, you probably are like, wait, what?
Yeah.
Or if you're not very involved in a major corporation, like I get it, which also makes me excited. Kind of a random note, but not too long ago, I saw my very first Celebrate Neurodiversity bumper sticker on a car in traffic, and it made me so happy.
Yeah.
Because I was like, to someone that I know, I was like, look, this exists off the internet. I'm not just like spinning my wheels about something that seems kind of nebulous and who knows what. That aside, neurodiversity as a whole really speaks to this idea that we have different brains, all of us. And that's a good thing. And when I say we have different brains, I'm not saying that we have diversity of opinions in politics. I'm not going down that route. And I think that's something that gets lost in this, is some people just assume neurodiversity is diversity of thought. And what we're saying is difference in cognition and how our brains work. So the way that we process information, the sensory experiences that we have, our intelligence or perceived intelligence, all these different things that affect how our brain works and how we experience the world. That's different. The way that you see things is different than the way that I experience things. And that's not a bad thing. So neurodiversity as a concept really speaks to, we all have different brains. We should accept this. We should respect this. This is normal.
Right.
And when we really kind of dive a little bit deeper, we have people who are neurotypical, which I know we've thrown around a little bit in the last couple minutes or so. And their brains act in ways that we're expecting and that are quote unquote normal. So nothing too out of the box. And then we have our community and others who are neurodivergent, whose brains do work outside of the box and outside of what we're expecting. And when we talk about who is neurodivergent, this is also where people get a little bit lost, is they think neurodivergent is just a nice catch-all that means autism light, or socially or corporately accessible or desirable people. So your autism with lower support needs / ADHD. That, my friends, frankly, is BS. When we're talking about neurodivergence and who is neurodivergent, we're talking about so much more. We're talking about people with autism. We're talking about ADHD. We're talking about learning disabilities. We're talking about intellectual disabilities. We're talking about mental health and psychiatric conditions, and also acquired cognitive differences. So I even make sure when I say acquired cognitive differences that we're bringing in our folks who might have had a traumatic brain injury or develop Alzheimer's or dementia, because that does change how you have cognitive function and how you experience the world. And I really always make a point when we do talk about neurodiversity to bring in people with intellectual disabilities and people with psych disabilities, because they are often the most marginalized and the most heavily stigmatized in this entire conversation. So I think once we get out of this autism ADHD bubble, although this did originate in the autistic community and from an autistic sociologist in the late 90s, that doesn't mean this is just about autism, that we all have different brains and we're not the only ones who are neurodivergent. I think that's something that we need to really kind of get to the core of. And when we think about who is neurodivergent, it's a huge group of people.
Absolutely. Yeah, no, definitely. And I think that like kind of what goes along with that is, and if you're just somebody, I always talk about social media a lot because I'm on social media a lot, Instagram, TikTok. Another word that I was hoping that you could really kind of break down for the audience is ableism, because, that's something that comes out a lot. And, I follow a couple TikTokers and they talk about these words, and I know that's not really where I should be getting all my scientific evidence. That's why I have a podcast.
Problem. That's not a problem. I learned plenty from social media because it's also where we get access to education that feels approachable and from people who have different life experiences and different backgrounds than we do. Okay, so like you mentioned, if you're in an affluent school district, you might not have people who are from other parts of the world or other parts of the country, or might be more marginalized or different socioeconomic statuses. So yes, you're going to get a different swath of the population through social media. That's great. It makes your learning a lot more intersectional than just hearing it from people who are constituents of your district. So that's wonderful. I am not against social media. I actually make my college students every once in a while check an autistic or neurodiversity hashtag just to see what that conversation looks like as compared to what they've learned from their textbooks the previous semester. And it is night and day. And they love telling me all about it. And I've made them read about the different faces of TikTok, for instance, and how the neurodivergent TikTokers are shockingly mostly women and non-binary, not this stereotypical 8-year-old white boy with autism that they're used to hearing about. So sidebar there, really big fan of that. But when we're talking about ableism, we can talk about this in the simple, or we can talk about it more complex. So to be a little bit more complex, I'm going to give us a definition that I use from the Center for Disability Rights to help break this down. And they define ableism as a set of beliefs or practices that devalue and discriminate against people with physical, intellectual, or psychiatric disabilities, and often rests on the assumption that disabled people need to be fixed in one way or another. That kind of goes back to our conversation that we were having about how we're not failed versions of normal and we're not broken neurotypicals. And the rest that they were saying is that ableism is intertwined in our culture due to many limiting beliefs about what disability does or does not mean, how non-disabled people learn to treat people with disabilities, and how we are often not included at the table for key decisions. So I like to break this down a little bit further. So we think about how this is within our culture in terms of our biases, our stereotypes, our language, that when we look around, ableism is a lot more rampant than we think it is, and how we don't even think about accessibility. So even with the podcast, something I was going to ask you probably offline actually was, do we have something like a transcript or subtitles or something that might make it so that people who have cognitive differences or who may have a hearing impairment or are deaf might be able to engage with what we're discussing? And even things like what language we have, how do we learn to treat people with disabilities? Think about how many people you talk about autism, or even when you tell them you're a speech therapist and work with autistic people, they say that you must be an angel, or that you have a heart of gold, or you're so patient, because we're somehow seen as less desirable people. Or if I say that I'm autistic, someone might go, well, you don't look autistic. Or they might go, I didn't know girls can have that. Or they go, I'm so sorry.
Right.
And all those things make me aggravated for different reasons. Some are microaggressions. Some are just ill-informed at best. Others actually do have that hint of cruelty behind them, even though most of the time people are very well intentioned. They just don't know that what they're doing is harmful.
Mm-hmm.
And also kind of back to our last point about how we're not often included at the table for key decisions. So I know we were talking about that conference committee and how I don't know until recent years if they even had self-advocates in those meetings. And even now being one of the few, and I've sat on nonprofit boards and committees where I am the only one. And it's the first time that they're even considering that perspective. Mm-hmm. So how do we make sure that we're including people with disabilities more naturally in the halls of power and not just seeing us as an object of pity? But ableism really is something that's difficult to deal with. And what makes it even more complicated is internalized ableism. And I know I don't want to complicate this further because I know this is new to a lot of people, is when you actually start to believe the stereotypes and stigmas and things associated with your own neurodivergence or disability. So when someone with ADHD or a learning disability or autism goes through life thinking that they're stupid or they're lazy, when really they're just struggling with executive functioning and they're not giving themselves that grace to understand that, or they internalize that maybe they're just unprofessional because they can't manage their time, or that their passions and interests are not age appropriate and that something is wrong with them, is we're really kind of beating into people that they think that they're broken or something is wrong with them. And even the way that some folks end up to be extreme people pleasers because they're fawning or something else as well, a lot of this kind of circles back to ableism for so many people in our community. And even when we think about masking and why we get conditional social acceptance, not social acceptance all around, because then you're written off as the weird kid or that you are you're not worth hanging out with or any of that stuff. So it's really interesting to see. And you can kind of play with this idea of ableism at all levels and all age groups. So whether it's parents telling a 4-year-old not to stare at someone in a wheelchair or not including someone, or that you can sit with the kids with disabilities for community service hours, you can go all the way through this, or that someone who is an ambulatory wheelchair user, you insist on helping them move the chair into the car when they say that they got it down pat, even though they're absolutely advocating for themselves and saying, I don't need your help, I promise. And you're going, no, I'll do it. And of course, that's of course how their chair gets busted. This happened to one of my friends not too long ago. So and of course you're hearing me say some of this and it sounds kind of cringe. And you're like, but based on how we're told to treat people with disabilities, we're taught just be nice to those poor people with disabilities, help them, always offer assistance. We're taught to follow this very prescribed set of rules. And that doesn't always turn out to be the case because we're individuals, that how each person reacts and feels is very different. I think it's very difficult for people to conceptualize sometimes that we're not a monolith of a group either.
And I think that's I really do feel like when people know better, they will do better. Obviously I like having the podcast because it's fun for me to, invite all the people that I want to talk to and have also my audience learn and share and incorporate these things into their practice. I think that's what's really the most important thing is I know just from following Robin Rosigno, on TikTok, and we actually have very kind of differing views on kind of some major things, but I had her on the podcast. She talked about autism in girls, but I really respect a lot of the things that she shares. But I really have picked up a lot of things, just simple little things from from people I've had on the podcast. Like, we've always been taught in school to say person first. Like that sounds very simple now, but to say a person with autism. But, I've learned that I do ask people. Yes, I think it's preference. I do like to ask people, but I do typically now say autistic individuals if I'm putting something static on social media, because if you don't, people get very upset about that. Yeah. But so from this idea there's a
lot there.
There's a lot to unpack there. Yeah. But if people are listening and they're like, gosh, are there things that I'm doing, that are maybe not so great for autistic individuals? Could you give us maybe just 2 or 3 points that might be something simple that to think about if you could talk to a speech therapist like you are now on the show, are there 2 things that you could leave with us as lasting kind of thoughts going forward? We've had a great conversation today, but I would love, what I think is so impactful about learning is actually allowing that learning to infiltrate and change how you're practicing, which I know that me, just with the platform I have and what I've learned, I've been able to, modify some things that I've been doing. So
for sure.
Or is there I keep
thinking a lot about when we think that kids aren't doing what we want them to do in a session or something like that is we just assume that they are, non-compliant. And we don't hold non-disabled people to that standard. That if I was non-compliant in a session and I was non-disabled, you'd go, well, Haley's probably just having a bad day. Or maybe there's something else going on there. You wouldn't just go, she's non-compliant and she's being absolutely terrible to work with. Like, even just look at how that bias changes. Right. And I think about this a lot with people with intellectual disabilities and how behavior gets talked about and written up a lot. Is that you might see like, John is oppositional because John threw a glass against the mirror. He is oppositional. There's a problem. We need to medicate him. We need to diagnose, blah, 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 blah. And then we think about, I don't know, Bob. Bob also threw something against the wall, but Bob just had a bad day. And then we're going, oh, Bob is just, an aggressive teenager or something. So even just how we talk about these types of things, it looks very different. That we're going to give that neurotypical seeming person or non-disabled person the benefit of the doubt of, oh, they had a bad day. And instead, we're going to just jump to this person's non-compliant and oppositional. So we have to understand kind of why. And I think that gets lost on a lot of people that work in behaviors, that behavior happens for a reason. And sometimes it's up to us to understand, maybe that kid is just tired. Maybe there's something else going on at home. And I think that's why when we talk about these conversations, I think the most important thing we could do is practice empathy. And I think we forget that little humans and children, for that matter, feel and experience a lot more, even if they don't have the words for it. I think about how many times in my life I have probably went to the nurse's office or something with a tummy ache. And looking back, I could probably tell you I might have been anxious. And young me might not have known what anxiety meant, but I just knew my stomach hurt or that I wanted to be home or whatever it might be. Maybe something was overwhelming, but a tummy ache was that thing that was safe to disclose because that made sense. So I think we have to meet kids where we're at. I think we have to understand, especially with young people, that behavior means so many different things. And sometimes you communicate it the only way you know how. And sometimes that just looks like acting out or a meltdown, or we fail. And then, of course, I know as professionals, we tend to internalize other people's behaviors. Oh, that kid just hates me. Or, oh, maybe I'm not bonding with them. Or we think it's our fault when realizing. And of course, when we think about our other relationships, we know it's not always our fault. We know that there's something else going on with another human being. So we have to kind of apply that. That's something I want us to think about, and even just how we have these discussions about what's going on and really taking the whole person into account. So I am not a huge fan whatsoever of high functioning, low functioning, profound, any of that stuff. It does not help me. Because I can give you two different versions of myself, and you will say one of these people is high functioning, one is not. And they're the exact same person in a huge cluster of things. There are things I need more support with and things I need no support with. Just like anybody else. There are things that I know you probably need support with. Like I know offline we were talking about how you need an assistant. But that doesn't mean that you are a failure at running things. That is just an accommodation or modification you had to make in your business. That makes total sense. But if we just said you're high functioning, we'd be like, okay, Rose is doing great. She definitely doesn't need an assistant. Look how well she's performing. And that totally ignores the fact that you're stressed and crying and you're like, I can't believe I'm running like 3 people's jobs at the same time. So I like to translate these things into neurotypical because then it makes sense to you. Like, okay, I totally get this. Of course, I'd be a total mess if I had to run everything by myself. So I think it's just how we conceptualize things and realizing when we try to apply it to us, we see it differently too. So that's why I really kind of love to push professionals into that. Challenge what you know. Think about how we talk about and how we compare people with disabilities and people without. I think about and of course, just being empathetic and seeing where that other person is coming from, even if they don't have the language to express it, that they might still be expressing it in some way, shape, or form without you really knowing. You might need to think about what is the kid's life like at home? What might have happened at school that day? So you might have a kid who might be non-responsive because maybe they were bullied in class, or maybe they had a meltdown in class and that didn't get communicated to you. And someone might not tell you that until after the fact. And you go, oh, well, no wonder that kid didn't want to participate in something else that after something stressful just happened. So I think we have to give people, especially autistic people, credit, because I think we're so quick to just brush them off and assume maybe we're not empathetic, maybe because we don't communicate it in that very specific neurotypical way that there's nothing going on. And as we know now, that's just not the case.
Yeah, that's a good point. And I know that word non-compliant, yeah, that gets thrown around a lot professionally. So you brought up a good point about the functioning labels. And I've posted on this on social media because I still hear people kind of using, yes. And, I had Dr. Kerry Magro on and he was like, people may, because people will say
I used to use them. I'm very honest about it. Well, I used them in my teenage life because that's all I knew, because that's what was taught to me.
Well, that's what people said.
And when I was a teenager, I looked at it as, because I was high functioning, I looked at it as I'm autistic, but not like that.
Right. And
like, I think socially acceptable autistic are like not like autistic, but not really.
Right.
Like,
and I think
like that you're somehow. But then when I actually needed support, nobody would give it to me. So.
Right. So what are your thoughts on? What are your thoughts on using? Because what I have seen online is people using terms like high support needs. I mean, what are your thoughts? Do you prefer that?
I do support needs. I do support needs because they're different, especially depending on the day, the person, but ideally describe what those needs are.
Right.
Is maybe this person, I like what support needs. It's a little bit more malleable. So I might need more support hypothetically in independent living, but I don't need support at work.
Right.
So I might have higher support needs in this area, but no support needs in that area.
Right.
So when I think about living, maybe I need help with something like meal prep or driving or any of these things that I find, or cleaning, any of these things that I find kind of difficult.
Yeah.
Of these like independent living tasks that I'm kind of still finagling my way around. Like I'm able to do it, but not very well. And then there's things that I don't need support with. I don't need support with running my business, for instance, or I don't need support with, say, scheduling our meeting because it's on Google Calendar and Google Calendar has saved my life 10,000 times. And I too would be a wreck without it.
Same. So, okay. Yeah. Because I think some people,
and I think some people have different needs at school. And I think we have to be aware. And this is why I also don't like high and low functioning.
Right.
Or profound anything is needs change over the lifespan.
Right.
The needs and support that I needed at 15 or at 5 are not the same as what you need at 25 or 35 or when you hit 65, for instance. Like your needs change over the life. And I think we're so quick to assume that what someone needs when they are first identified as a child. And I know, and I'm just making a very blanket statement here because I'm aware that many people are not diagnosed or identified as children. But I know that you work with kids, so that's why I'm using that. Just as a caveat to anyone who's listening, I'm not just being completely out of touch here. I'm just trying to make sure that I'm covering my bases for the purpose of our conversation.
Right.
But when we're thinking about that, I just really want us to think about how that person's needs might change, maybe with interventions, maybe with being in a good supportive environment, all sorts of other lifespan and environmental factors that go into what needs someone has. So the needs that I had at 3, I needed more support with things like talking and communication. I don't need that same support now.
Right.
There are people who are AAC users who might need that as one of their support needs. And that's something that we need to address. So I always think address the needs very specifically, but high and low are great. And then when you say someone has high support needs, they might need daily assistance in independent living. They might need X, Y, and Z. They might need a teacher's aide when they're in their 3rd grade classroom. When you describe the needs, it humanizes the person, which I know is what we all try to do as professionals. I know, especially in legal, anytime I've had to work with or consult on a case that featured autistic people, I would say, please tell us what this person needs. And also, that's great for the lawyers because then we know how to accommodate them if they are coming into court or a deposition or something else. So if we know this person has high support needs or high sensory needs, we know, okay, maybe don't schedule an 8-hour deposition. Schedule some breaks, maybe have a quiet room inside of the office, just something. That says we know how to accommodate and care about this person so that they are able to succeed and do what they have to do in their daily life. So no, functioning labels are something that I've had to unlearn in my adult life because I really did use it, especially as a teenager, based on what I knew about autism and what little I knew about autistic community, because I didn't really know that many autistic people growing up. I didn't know autistic people for the first time until I went to a conference, to be quite honest.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
And you think like autistic, but not like them, because my very first introduction to autism outside of my own experience was through the Babysitters Club. Oh, wow. And the character in the Babysitters Club that was written in 1990 was called the R Word. She had these savant skills.
Oh, really?
She was at a special school. She was, and then of course it's really outdated when you go back to read it. And of course my impression of that was, yeah, that's not like me.
Right. Uh-huh. Oh,
that you are somehow
mm-hmm.
superior to that. And that's just not true. We're not superior to other human beings.
Right.
Which is also, I think, when you see online probably thrown around the idea of Aspie supremacy is people who still identify with like Asperger's syndrome, that they're somehow above the other autistic people. Which is how it often gets used in this day and age. And of course, when you know the history about Hans Asperger and anti-Semitism and the Nazis and all this stuff, you're like, oh my God, we really have a lot of work to unpack.
There's a lot to that because I didn't even know that was a thing.
I teach this to my students every semester. It freaks them out.
Yeah.
This was a more recent.
What class do you, or what kind of class do you teach?
I teach in the psychology department at Taylor University in Indiana, and I teach an ethics class on autism interventions, and I teach an understanding autism course that's more of a general overview and kind of that neurodiversity from an inside perspective. And we talk about all these different social issues. We talked about
how amazing.
And I will do it through a neurodiversity and social political lens because I think it's far more interesting. So we've talked about the hard topics in my class.
Yeah.
Even though I don't always think I'm the right person to have those discussions, and I try to bring guests in whenever I can. But we've talked about things like police brutality and encounters in the autistic community. We've talked about sub-minimum wage and unemployment. We've talked about what happens when autistic people commit sex offenses and things like that. Like, we've had the hard conversations.
Yeah.
And I think it makes it far more interesting, especially because I think about what I want the next generation of professionals to know. It's sometimes the first time they've met an autistic adult and really heard. So when they get an entire semester to learn and get a crash course almost on like autistic experience.
That's amazing.
I think about what would I want professionals to know. And it's not the what is autism. Autism is a neurodevelopmental disability, blah, blah, blah. No. We're going to talk about your clients are going to face some real world stuff.
Yeah.
Here's some of the stuff that they're going to deal with at all ages. They might be dealing with IEPs. You may or may not be part of an IEP team. And we talked about what your role is on an IEP team in my last semester because we talked about ethics and professional issues. What happens if you don't agree with other members of your team? How do you have those conversations? Who legally has to be there? Who doesn't? So we've had all sorts of fun conversations. And I think what makes it interesting for me is really that even though I don't like to admit it, autism is extremely political. Is that your existence in a world that doesn't always value you or that spews different conspiracy theories about people like you and anti-vaxxers and all of this other stuff. It's a journey.
Yeah. It's a lot.
So you have to kind of make sure that your next generation of professionals is informed just beyond whatever they read in a book.
I love that. Wow. Those students are lucky to learn from you.
I really enjoy having them.
Yeah.
And I'm really excited for where they end up going with their career. So I know a lot of them do want to be BCBAs. Some of them are already RBTs.
Yeah.
There's a couple that want to be school psychologists. I have one that's going to be an art therapist. I'm so happy and can't wait to see what a neurodiversity informed group looks like, because I think this is the first time that, at least at the undergraduate level, we're really starting to have these neurodiversity conversations and not just something on the internet. And I actually do give a lot of sources from the internet. So I have made them read about TikTok stars. I have actually made them read opinion pieces and journalism more often than academic stuff, because I'm like, this is the conversation.
Right.
And some of this stuff, the research hasn't been conclusive yet on, say, the impact of police brutality on autistic people. And we all know anecdotally and realistically what happens with police departments or autistic people of color. And they're not going to hear about the stories of some more marginalized people unless it comes from the internet.
Yeah. No, I love that. Such great information. Oh my goodness. Thank you so much for coming on.
I get really geeky. I get really excited.
No, I love it. It's such great information.
That's what you're going to learn. That's what you're going to learn about me. I'm just a big nerd on this topic.
I love it. It's good information. If people want to learn more about you and or ask a question, do you have a website or can you let people know where you're at, like online?
Absolutely. Say hello to me. I'm at haleymoss.com, or you can visit me on Facebook, Twitter, or Instagram. I love getting to meet people. I love getting to connect with you and getting to, again, learn more together, because I think that's the really amazing thing about this community is we all are learning.
Thanks
and we're
so
all
much.
growing.
Yes, definitely. Thanks so much, Hallie, for coming on. It was great to meet you.
You too.
Thanks for listening to Autism Outreach. If you enjoyed the show today, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss an episode full of actionable strategies you can use in your therapy room. Write a review too. That would mean so much to me. I always love hearing from you. Have a specific topic that you want included on a future show? Reach out over on Instagram, ABA Speech by Rose, or visit me at www.abaspeech.org.